The last ordinary thing Eleanor Hartwell did before her life fractured was forget her gloves on the edge of a polished oak table. The mistake was small, almost laughable. She would remember it later with a kind of clinical fascination, how something so trivial could become the hinge upon which everything turned. Before that night, Eleanor Hartwell had been many things. For 35 years, she had been one of the country's most respected heritage structural consultants. While developers chased glass towers and quick profits, she fought for limestone facades, hand-carved cornices, timber beams shaped by craftsmen long dead. She believed buildings carried memory the way people carried scars, visible only to those who knew where to look. She did not restore structures for nostalgia. She restored them because history, once erased, never negotiated its return. The dinner was her son's idea. Adrian Hartwell had insisted on something special. He chose Blackwood Hall, a renovated 19th-century courthouse turned private dining club on the edge of the river. The ceilings arched high above, like a cathedral of amber light. Shelves of antique law books lined the walls behind glass. Soft music drifted through the room in restrained elegance. To an observer, it was a portrait of familial devotion, a son celebrating his mother's 64th birthday and her gradual step back from professional life. Adrian sat across from her, posture relaxed but alert, his dark suit tailored with quiet precision. Beside him was his wife, Celeste, immaculate as always, composed, her smile practiced to land somewhere between warmth and admiration. The table was curated. Crystal glasses. Plates arranged like architectural renderings. Wine decanted and breathing. "Mom, you deserve rest," Adrian said, voice calm and resonant. "You've carried entire cities on your shoulders." Celeste nodded gently. "No one's questioning your brilliance. But maybe it's time to protect your health." Protect. That word had been appearing more often. For months, Eleanor's vision had been unreliable. Lines blurred at the edges. Draft measurements occasionally doubled. Depth felt unpredictable, like walking through fog that only she could see. She blamed exhaustion. Long hours. Age. Age was an easy explanation. It offended no one. But that evening something else unsettled her, a faint tilt to the room, as though gravity itself had shifted a degree off-center. "You've been squinting," Adrian observed lightly. "It's not weakness to admit you need help." Help. The conversation moved carefully, almost tenderly, toward logistics. Temporary oversight of her firm. Signatory assistance. Delegated authority for pending restoration bids. The language was soft, padded with affection. Eleanor listened. She had built Hartwell Conservation from a rented office with 2 folding tables and 1 borrowed drafting lamp. She had fought corporations that considered demolition cheaper than patience. She had preserved railway stations, libraries, public halls. She had stood in freezing rain arguing for stone. Now, at a table under golden light, she felt as though she were the unstable structure. "Just think about it," Celeste said, touching her hand. "Let Adrian shoulder the pressure." Pressure. Eleanor nodded slowly. "I'll consider it." The relief on their faces was immediate. It flashed across them before they could hide it. That flash lodged in her chest like splintered wood. When dinner ended, Eleanor stood carefully. The marble floor seemed subtly unsteady. Adrian offered his arm. She declined with a polite shake of the head. "I need air," she said. Outside, the river wind was sharp and metallic. She reached for her gloves. Not there. She checked her coat pocket. Nothing. Annoyed with herself, she turned back. The club was quieter now. Staff stacking chairs. Lights dimming 1 row at a time. She stepped inside and paused. Stillness. Not the comfortable quiet of closing hours, but something denser. Expectant. A young server near the entrance was watching her, too intently. Pale.
tense.
Ma'am, the woman said quickly. You came back.
Yes.
My gloves. I left them. The heavy front door clicked shut behind her.
Locked.
The sound was soft, final. Eleanor turned sharply. I'm simply retrieving my things. I know, the server whispered.
Please.
Don't leave yet. The woman's name tag read Lila. Her fingers trembled at her sides. Every instinct Eleanor had cultivated over decades, reading subtle structural failures, hidden fractures, activated at once. Something was wrong. I don't feel steady, Eleanor said, steadying herself against the wall. If this is some misunderstanding. It's not, Lila said. I wasn't supposed to check the cameras, but I did. The words settled cold in the air. Lila gestured toward a corridor behind the reception desk. You need to see something. Eleanor should have refused. Should have demanded the door be opened. But there was urgency in the young woman's face, not mischief, not cruelty.
Fear.
They moved quickly through a narrow service hallway into a cramped office, lit only by the glow of security monitors. Lila closed the door and pulled up a recording. That table, she said softly. I had a bad feeling. The footage flickered to life in grainy monochrome. There it was, their table. The timestamp read 27 minutes earlier. Eleanor watched herself rise and leave the frame. What happened next altered everything. Adrian's posture changed first. The softness evaporated. He scanned the room, not with concern, but calculation. Celeste shifted subtly, angling her body to shield the table from view. Adrian reached into his jacket. Eleanor leaned closer to the screen without realizing it. He removed a slender vial.
Clear.
Deliberate. He tilted it over her wine glass.
Drops. Precise.
Controlled. Celeste smiled, not nervous. Amused. Lila turned up the audio. She thinks it's stress, Adrian said casually. The neurologist bought it. Celeste's laugh was low. How much longer? Another few weeks at this concentration, Adrian replied. Her sight will be unreliable enough to scare her. She'll sign everything. The room seemed to contract. Eleanor's hand found the desk edge and tightened. On the screen, Adrian swirled the wine gently, admiring it like a connoisseur. No permanent damage, he added. We're not monsters. Celeste's expression said otherwise. Eleanor's knees gave way. She sank into the chair behind her. Her son, not frustrated, not desperate.
Strategic.
Lila's voice trembled. I'm so sorry. Eleanor could not speak. The footage continued, Adrian mimicking her unsteady movements, Celeste stifling laughter. It had not been concern at dinner. It had been orchestration. The diagnosis, the suggestions of stepping down, the carefully timed paperwork, all calibrated. Months of subtle visual distortion. Exposure, repeated. A campaign. The word settled into her mind with icy clarity. Campaign. She inhaled slowly.
Once. Twice.
Rage surged, but beneath it something colder and more useful formed. Understanding. If the impairment was chemical, it was controlled. If it was controlled, it could be traced. Do you know what it is? She asked quietly. Lila hesitated. My brother works in toxicology. I've seen compounds like that in training videos. They don't kill. They destabilize. Destabilize. Like undermining load-bearing stone. Eleanor rose carefully. She no longer felt like a failing structure. She felt like an engineer who had finally located the fault line. Did anyone else see this? She asked.
No.
Then you saw nothing tonight. I forgot my gloves. I returned. I left. Lila nodded immediately. Eleanor retrieved her gloves from the hostess stand. When she stepped back into the night, the river air felt sharper.
Tua.
She did not cry. She did not call Adrian. Instead, She drove home in silence, her mind mapping possibilities the way it once mapped historic foundations. Someone had decided she was obsolete. Someone had mistaken age for erosion. They were wrong. Inside her study, she placed her gloves on the desk. Then she locked the door. The fracture in her life had appeared. Now she would determine how far it ran. Eleanor did not sleep. The house felt unfamiliar, as though its walls had absorbed the betrayal and were holding it in their plaster. She sat in her private study until dawn. Lights low, curtains drawn, her thoughts moving with disciplined precision. Emotion could come later. What mattered now was structure. Poison designed to imitate deterioration had one essential flaw. It required consistency, repetition, measured dosage, which meant there would be traces in her body, in her home, in the routines Adrian and Celeste believed invisible. At 6:10 a.m., she entered her secondary workshop. Few people knew the room existed. It had once been a materials testing lab when she first started her career, before her firm expanded. Over the decades, she had converted it into a private research space. Shelves of labeled samples lined the walls, limestone fragments, aged mortar composites, oxidized steel rods, timber cross-sections from century-old rafters. To others it might have looked like a museum of decay. To Eleanor, it was a record of cause and effect. She closed the door, locked it, and began. The gloves from the restaurant went onto the stainless steel table. The napkin she had used during dinner followed. She carefully removed a faint wine stain from the fabric with sterile swabs, sealing each sample in separate containers. Her movements were steady. Whatever compound Adrian had used, it had been chosen for subtlety. Not lethal, not dramatic. It had to blur vision, disrupt focus, produce instability without raising immediate medical alarms. She powered on her portable analyzer, an older spectroscopic unit she had kept from a consulting contract years ago. It wasn't hospital grade, but it was precise enough to identify synthetic interference. The machine hummed to life. Minutes stretched. Her pulse remained calm. The first reading confirmed alcohol. The second revealed something else, a secondary compound with a synthetic profile. Neuroactive. Temporary suppression of optic signal transmission. Not widely available, but not experimental either. She ran the test again. Same result. She leaned back slowly. It wasn't age. It wasn't stress.
It was design.
The realization did not break her. It clarified her. If the exposure stopped, the symptoms would gradually reverse, which meant she was not declining, she was being managed like a project. She stood and walked into the kitchen. Every item Adrian or Celeste had brought into the house over the past 6 months now demanded inspection. Her eyes moved across the counters with new awareness.
Things.
Supplement bottles. A jar of imported honey, Celeste insisted, was good for circulation. A decanter of herbal tonic Adrian had praised. She opened the tonic first. The scent was faintly medicinal beneath the herbs. A sample went into a sterile vial. Then the supplements. The label was glossy, cheerful, promises of clarity and vitality. But one corner lifted too easily. Eleanor peeled it back. Beneath the decorative wrap was a different brand mark printed directly onto the bottle, minimalist, corporate. Her breath slowed. She recognized the symbol instantly. Kessler Urban Holdings, a powerful development consortium known for aggressive acquisition of protected districts. For years, Eleanor had stood in their path. She had blocked demolition permits, challenged redevelopment filings, forced heritage designations that cost them millions. Kessler didn't negotiate with obstacles. They removed them. She set the bottle down carefully. This was no longer only about inheritance or control of her firm. This was corporate leverage. She moved through the house methodically. In the guest bedroom closet, Tucked inside a storage box beneath folded blankets, she found them. 6 identical vials in protective foam casing.
Supply.
Sustained exposure required planning. Her son had not acted alone. She sat on the edge of the bed, one vial resting in her palm. It looked harmless.
Clear liquid.
Innocent. She imagined Adrian measuring drops with clinical precision.
Weeks.
Months. Waiting for her confidence to fracture. Waiting for her to surrender authority voluntarily. Rage flickered. But rage was inefficient. Strategy was superior. She returned to her study and began mapping a timeline. First symptoms, 5 months ago, coincided with Adrian's increased visits. Dinners.
Der.
Supplements recommended by specialists. Medical appointments arranged by him. She pulled out her calendar. The pattern was undeniable. Symptoms intensified after shared meals. Improved when she traveled alone. Never constant. Always variable. Engineered instability. At 8:30 a.m., her phone vibrated. Adrian. She let it ring twice before answering. Mom? Just checking in. How's your vision this morning? His tone was warm. Concerned. She allowed her voice to waver. It's worse, she whispered. Everything feels foggy. I nearly tripped walking to the kitchen. A pause. Then measured sympathy. This is exactly why we need to move quickly. Stress accelerates neurological decline.
Decline.
He was rehearsed. I don't want to fight it anymore, she said softly. Bring the documents today. The silence that followed was brief, but inside it, she heard satisfaction. Of course, he replied. We'll come this afternoon. When the call ended, Eleanor placed the phone down gently. The bait had been accepted. Now she needed protection. She drove to a private clinic unaffiliated with the neurologist Adrian had recommended months earlier. She requested full blood analysis, citing suspected toxin exposure. The physician on duty, Dr. Rahman, listened carefully as she described intermittent symptoms. Exposure timing? He asked. Possibly with ingestion, she replied evenly. Tests were ordered immediately. While waiting, she composed a secure message to Marcus Doyle, her firm's long-standing legal advisor. She did not explain everything, only that emergency asset review protocols might need activation. Marcus responded within minutes. Call me when you can speak privately. By noon she was back home. She removed every contaminated item from the kitchen, sealing them in evidence bags. She photographed the vials, the altered supplement bottle, the corporate insignia. Documentation was survival. At 1:50 p.m., she arranged herself in the sitting room. Shoulders slightly hunched. Eyes unfocused. Hands trembling. When Adrian and Celeste arrived, they entered with confidence, disguised as care. Mom, Adrian said gently. We brought fresh copies. Celeste placed a bakery box on the table. Your favorite almond cake. Eleanor squinted vaguely. Oh dear, she murmured. I can barely see the icing. They exchanged a glance, fleeting, but unmistakable. Adrian opened the folder. It's straightforward. Temporary transfer of operational authority. Just until you feel stronger. Temporary. She let the pen wobble between her fingers. Oh, I'm hopeless today, she sighed. Then she knocked the water glass over. Documents flooded. Ink bled instantly. Adrian's composure cracked, just for a second. It's fine, he said tightly. We'll reprint. She clutched her chest theatrically. I'm so sorry. Perhaps I should sign at the Heritage Council meeting next week.
Publicly.
So no one questions it. Adrian hesitated. Public meant scrutiny, but it also meant legitimacy. Yes, he said slowly. That could work. Celeste smiled again. Calculated relief. They believed delay favored them. As Adrian stepped outside to make a call, Eleanor drifted toward the hallway. Through the cracked patio door, she heard him clearly. She's deteriorating faster, he said. After the council vote, we push permits immediately. A voice on speaker responded, distorted but authoritative. Ensure continuity of dosage until signature. Dosage. Confirmation. Eleanor stepped back silently. This was bigger than inheritance. It was acquisition. When Adrian returned inside, he kissed her cheek. Rest, he said softly. She nodded. After they left, she locked the door. Then she made 3 calls. Marcus Doyle, Dr. Ramon, and finally, someone she had not spoken to in years, Thomas Grady, former compliance officer for Kessler Urban Holdings. If corporate interference was involved, she would need proof beyond suspicion. As dusk settled, Dr. Ramon called. Toxicology confirms intermittent exposure to a synthetic optic suppressor, he said.
Non-lethal.
Reversible, but deliberate. There it was. Medical validation. Not decline. Assault. Eleanor stood in her study, looking at the original blueprints of her first restoration project pinned to the wall. For months, they had tried to erode her confidence, to make her doubt her own perception. But perception, once corrected, became weaponized clarity. They believed her weakening. In truth, they had triggered the one response they should have feared most. She was no longer reacting. She was rebuilding. And this time, she would reinforce every foundation they tried to fracture. She picked up the vial again. Transparent.
Precise.
Temporary. Like their advantage. Outside, the evening darkened. Inside, Eleanor Hartwell began drafting something far more permanent. By the 3rd morning, Eleanor no longer felt like a victim of a carefully staged decline. She felt like an architect standing inside a building she now understood completely. Every hidden beam, every disguised fracture, every load-bearing deception. The difference between collapse and survival, she had always believed, was not strength. It was preparation. Marcus Doyle arrived just after sunrise. He had been her legal counsel for 22 years, discreet, methodical, and allergic to drama. He entered her study without pleasantries, closing the door behind him. You said emergency protocol, he began. Eleanor handed him the lab report from Dr. Ramon, the photographs of the vials, the altered supplement bottle bearing Kessler's insignia, and a typed timeline of exposure patterns. Marcus read in silence. His expression did not change, but his breathing did, slower, heavier. This is criminal, he said finally. Yes. And coordinated. Yes. He placed the documents carefully on the desk. Do you believe Adrian understands the corporate involvement? Eleanor considered the question. He understands enough, she replied. Whether he believes he's controlling it or being used by it is secondary. Marcus nodded once. You're aware that once this moves formally, it becomes public. I am aware. And if he's arrested, he made his choice. There was no tremor in her voice. Marcus studied her for a moment, as if reassessing the woman across from him. They're expecting a signature at the Heritage Council meeting next week? Yes. And the transfer documents? Prepared, flooded, reprinted. Marcus allowed himself the faintest smile. You staged incompetence. I staged expectation. He leaned back. All right, then we counter at scale. Eleanor rose and walked toward the built-in cabinet behind her drafting table. She pressed a recessed latch hidden beneath a molding strip. A narrow panel slid open, revealing a steel lockbox embedded within the wall. Marcus blinked. You never mentioned that. I never needed to. She unlocked it. Inside were layered folders, sealed envelopes, and notarized documents bearing dates that stretched back nearly 15 years. Contingency architecture, she said. Marcus stepped closer. At the center was a private preservation trust, Hartwell Cultural Conservancy, registered quietly during a period when hostile acquisition rumors first began circling her firm. Every protected property her company had restored was bound not only by public heritage status, but by secondary contractual clauses embedded within restoration grants and endowment agreements. Clauses that triggered automatic reversion of authority if she were declared incapacitated under suspicious conditions or pressured into transfer. Marcus scanned the primary document. You built a legal failsafe into every contract. Yes. And the board, unaware of its full scope. He looked up sharply. Even Adrian? Especially Adrian. Marcus let out a long breath. If these activate, Kessler can't touch a single site. Correct. And if they attempt to override, it becomes federal interference with protected cultural assets. Silence settled between them. Not shock, but recognition. Eleanor had not spent decades defending history without anticipating retaliation. The difference now was that retaliation had come through blood. Marcus closed the folder carefully. Then we need two parallel tracks, he said. Criminal investigation and trust activation. Quietly. Simultaneously. Eleanor nodded. I also want corporate exposure, she added. Not just Adrian. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That will be more complex. I have time. He studied her again. You're certain? She met his gaze steadily. They tried to convince me my mind was failing. I will not repay that with hesitation. By midday, the strategy was in motion. Marcus contacted a federal investigator he trusted, discreet, experienced in white-collar crime with cross-border implications. The toxicology report and surveillance footage were transferred through encrypted channels. Meanwhile, Eleanor made a separate call. Thomas Grady answered on the fourth ring. Eleanor Hartwell, he said, surprised. I haven't heard from you in years. I need information, she replied. Thomas had once served as compliance director for Kessler Urban Holdings before resigning abruptly. Officially, it was a career pivot. Unofficially, rumors of internal ethical conflicts had circulated. Kessler doesn't forget grudges, Thomas said quietly after she outlined the situation. You cost them 7 major acquisitions.
I'm aware.
They've been restructuring. Quiet partnerships. Offshore subsidiaries. They don't attack directly anymore. They destabilize. The word landed precisely. Do they fund pharmaceutical intermediaries? She asked. A pause. They fund shell corporations that fund research entities. Plausible deniability. Would you testify if necessary? Thomas hesitated, not out of fear, but calculation. If I have evidence. You will, she said calmly. By evening, Eleanor felt something she had not felt in months. Control. Not over Adrian. Not over Kessler. Over the structure of the situation itself. That night Adrian called. How are you feeling? He asked gently. She allowed faint fragility into her tone. Uncertain, she said. The council meeting feels overwhelming. You won't have to speak much, he assured her. Just sign. I'll handle the rest. She closed her eyes briefly. I trust you, she whispered. The silence on his end was filled with satisfaction. Rest, he said. Everything will be easier soon. After the call, she wrote down every word. Language was evidence. The following day brought further confirmation. Dr. Rahman forwarded expanded toxicology analysis, microdose synthetic optic pathway inhibitors, metabolizing within 48 hours. Harmless if discontinued. Damaging only through repetition. She had been chemically managed. The insult was almost academic. Marcus returned that afternoon with updates. Federal investigators are interested, he said. Very interested. Particularly in the corporate link. And Adrian? They want to catch him in continuity. Continuity. Evidence that the dosing would have continued through the council meeting. Eleanor understood immediately. If he attempts further administration. Yes. She considered. He'll bring something, she said. He won't risk deterioration reversing before the signature. Marcus nodded. Then we prepare. Preparation did not mean confrontation. It meant documentation. Eleanor installed discrete recording devices in her sitting room, legal in her jurisdiction as sole property owner. Marcus coordinated with investigators to monitor the council chamber on meeting day. The trap would not be dramatic. It would be procedural. 2 days before the meeting, Adrian and Celeste arrived again. This time with tea. Herbal, Celeste said lightly. Good for circulation. Eleanor accepted the cup with trembling fingers. As they spoke, she pretended distraction. When Celeste looked away, Eleanor switched the cups. Later, in her private lab, analysis confirmed presence of the same compound. Evidence multiplied. On the morning of the council meeting, Eleanor dressed with deliberate care. Navy suit. Minimal jewelry.
No sobe.
She practiced walking without the exaggerated instability she had displayed earlier. Her vision had largely cleared. Colors were sharper. Edges defined. Recovery was its own vindication. Marcus met her outside the council building. Investigators are in position, he said quietly. If he attempts anything today, it's over. She nodded. Inside, Adrian was already seated, confidence radiating from him like heat. Celeste whispered something in his ear, smiling. They believed momentum was irreversible. Eleanor took her seat at the front table. The transfer documents lay waiting. The pen gleamed. She looked at her son. For a fleeting second, she saw not the strategist, not the conspirator, but the child she once carried across a construction site, teaching him how to recognize load-bearing walls. He had learned well. He simply chose to remove them. The council chair called her name. She stood. Steady. The room quieted. Adrian leaned forward slightly, anticipation barely contained. Eleanor placed her hands on the table. I have prepared a statement, she began calmly. Behind the back wall, federal agents adjusted their earpieces. And for the first time since the dinner at Blackwood Hall, Eleanor felt no tilt in the room at all. Everything was level. Everything was clear. The counterstructure was complete. The council chamber carried the kind of silence reserved for irreversible decisions. High ceilings arched overhead, carved wood beams darkened by time. Tall windows filtered pale morning light across rows of seated officials, preservation advocates, legal observers, and a handful of developers who rarely missed meetings involving valuable land. Adrian sat 2 seats to Eleanor's right, posture immaculate, a leather folder resting beneath his palm. Celeste beside him appeared serene, hands folded, eyes bright with contained triumph. They were ready for a transfer of power. They were not prepared for exposure. Eleanor adjusted the microphone slightly. For months, she began, voice steady and clear, I believed my declining vision was the natural progression of age. Adrian's smile was sympathetic, encouraging. Several council members nodded gently. She continued, I was wrong. A ripple of uncertainty moved through the room. I have undergone independent medical analysis. The results confirm repeated ingestion of a synthetic optic pathway inhibitor. The word synthetic sharpened the air. Adrian shifted almost imperceptibly. Celeste's fingers tightened around her purse. Eleanor reached into her briefcase and placed 3 items carefully on the table: the toxicology report, the vial retrieved from her guest room, and the altered supplement bottle with the partially peeled label. These substances were administered without my knowledge, she said evenly. The exposure pattern was deliberate, measured, and timed. The council chair leaned forward. Ms. Hartwell, are you alleging criminal conduct? I am stating medical fact. Murmurs swelled across the chamber. Adrian cleared his throat. Mom, he said gently, leaning toward the microphone. You're confused. We discussed experimental treatment options. You agreed. No, she replied calmly, without raising her voice. I did not. The clarity in her tone landed harder than accusation. She turned slightly toward the back of the chamber. Please display the footage. A large projection screen descended from the wall behind the council bench. Marcus, seated near the aisle, signaled to the technician. The grainy black and white recording from Blackwood Hall filled the room. The timestamp glowed at the bottom. The chamber grew very still. Eleanor's recorded image stood from the restaurant table and exited the frame. Then Adrian appeared on screen, posture altering, scanning the room. He reached into his jacket. Gasps spread like a shockwave. The vial appeared in his hand. He tilted it over the wine glass. Drops fell. Celeste leaned inward, shielding the motion. The audio crackled to life. She thinks it's stress, Adrian's recorded voice said lightly. A low murmur broke from the audience. How much longer? Celeste asked in the recording. Another few weeks, Adrian replied. Her sight will destabilize enough to scare her. She'll sign. The recording continued for several more seconds before Marcus paused it. Silence. Absolute. Adrian's face had drained of color. This is manipulated, he said sharply. Out of context. We were discussing dosage adjustments from her neurologist. Which neurologist? Eleanor asked calmly.
He faltered.
The one you recommended, she continued, who is now under formal review. The council chair's expression had hardened. Security, he said quietly toward the side of the room. Two uniformed officers moved discreetly toward the chamber doors. Celeste's composure fractured first. You don't understand, she said, voice shaking. This wasn't meant to hurt you. It was temporary, just enough to make you step back. The admission hovered in the air like smoke. Adrian turned toward her sharply. Stop. But the damage was done. Eleanor felt no triumph, only resolution. She lifted the supplement bottle and peeled back the false label fully, revealing the corporate insignia beneath. Kessler Urban Holdings, she said clearly. A developer currently engaged in acquisition attempts on 6 protected districts under my authority. All eyes shifted. One council member whispered, Good God. Marcus rose from his seat and addressed the chamber. We have documentation linking this compound to a shell research entity funded indirectly by Kessler subsidiaries. Federal investigators are present. As if on cue, 2 plainclothes agents stepped forward from the back row. The room erupted into overlapping voices. Adrian stood abruptly. This is absurd, he snapped. She's paranoid. You're all overreacting. Eleanor turned toward him slowly. For 5 months, she said, I questioned my competence. I questioned my perception. I questioned whether I had become a liability to the very structures I fought to protect. Her gaze did not waver. You manufactured that doubt.
His jaw tightened.
It was going to be cleaner this way, he said under his breath. Too low for the microphone, but not low enough to avoid the recording devices Marcus had arranged. One of the federal agents stepped forward. Mr. Hartwell, he said calmly, we need you to come with us. Celeste grabbed Adrian's arm. This is insane, she whispered. He pulled away, anger overtaking calculation. You're destroying everything, he said to Eleanor. No, she replied quietly. You tried to. The agents escorted him toward the exit.
No dramatic struggle. No shouting.
Just the slow unraveling of confidence built on assumption. Celeste remained seated for a moment longer, eyes wide and unfocused. Then she stood unsteady. This wasn't just us, she said suddenly, looking at the council members. You think developers don't pressure? You think they don't make calls? We were protecting the firm. By poisoning its founder? One council member asked coldly. She had no answer. She left without another word. The chamber remained unsettled long after the doors closed behind them. Eleanor faced the council again. In anticipation of coercion, she said evenly, I established a private preservation trust 15 years ago. All properties restored under Hartwell Conservation are legally bound by reversion clauses. Any attempt to transfer authority under duress activates immediate protective review. The council chair exhaled slowly. So no permits can move forward. Correct. And Kessler's pending applications? Suspended automatically. A faint tremor of relief moved through the preservation advocates in the room. One elderly council member removed his glasses. You planned for this? I planned for hostility, Eleanor replied. Not from family, but from anyone who believed history could be liquidated. The chair nodded once. This meeting is adjourned pending formal investigation. Gavel struck wood. The sound echoed, not like a verdict, but like a seal. As the room emptied, Marcus approached her. You held steady, he said quietly. So did the structure, she replied. Outside the chamber, reporters had already begun gathering. Word traveled quickly when corporate names and criminal allegations collided. Flashbulbs flickered. Questions erupted. Eleanor paused at the top of the courthouse steps. For months, she said to the press, voice firm but measured, I was made to believe that age had diminished my capacity. Today we have evidence that what looked like decline was engineered interference. She allowed the words to settle. Let this serve as a reminder. Vulnerability is often manufactured by those who benefit from it. Marcus guided her toward the waiting car. Inside, she finally allowed herself a long exhale. It was not grief she felt. It was recalibration. Back at her home, the silence was different now. Not heavy.
Cleared.
She walked through the kitchen, past the emptied cabinets, past the space where trust had once lived without question. Her vision was steady, edges sharp. She entered her workshop and turned on the lamp above her drafting table. The light fell across unfinished restoration plans for a 19th century opera house scheduled for preservation review next month. She studied the cross-sections, foundations, reinforcements, load redistribution. The principles were universal. When stress targeted a single point, you redistributed weight across a stronger network. You didn't remove the structure. You strengthened it. Her phone buzzed. A message from Dr. Rahman. Full recovery expected within days. No permanent damage. She set the phone down. On her desk lay a photograph of Adrian at 8 years old, standing beside her at a construction site, wearing an oversized hard hat and smiling with absolute trust. She turned the photograph face down. Some losses required no ceremony. By evening, news channels carried the story. Corporate interference, chemical manipulation, heritage protection. The narrative no longer belonged to Adrian. It belonged to evidence. And evidence, once illuminated, did not fade easily. Eleanor stood at her window, watching dusk settle across the city's skyline she had helped preserve. They had tried to erase her influence quietly. Instead, they had amplified it. The public unraveling was complete. What remained now was rebuilding, not her firm, not her reputation. Those had never truly collapsed. What remained was redefining legacy. And that would be done on her terms. 3 months after the council chamber fell silent, the city looked the same. Stone facades still caught the morning light. Church spires still interrupted the skyline. The old railway terminal still stood defiant against the steel and glass towers rising in neighboring districts. But beneath the visible surface, the foundations had shifted. Kessler Urban Holdings was under federal investigation. Shell subsidiaries unraveled one by one, exposing a web of quiet acquisitions, manipulated zoning votes, and ethically flexible consultants. Several senior executives resigned before subpoenas could reach their desks. Adrian Hartwell's case moved more slowly. Charges were formal: aggravated assault through chemical administration, conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted coercive asset transfer. His legal team argued intent without harm.
Temporary intervention.
Familial misunderstanding. The toxicology reports disagreed. So did the footage. Eleanor did not attend the preliminary hearings. Not because she feared facing him, because the legal process was now a structural matter, and she had always believed that once a building was stabilized, you did not hover over the scaffolding. You let the reinforcement cure. Hartwell Conservation no longer existed in its previous corporate form. Within weeks of the council meeting, Eleanor dissolved the private ownership structure and formally transferred all assets into the Hartwell Cultural Conservancy, the trust she had built quietly years earlier. But this time it was not hidden. It was public, transparent, board-governed, irreversible. Every property restored under her leadership was permanently bound by layered legal protections. Future leadership required supermajority approval from preservation scholars, legal historians, and community trustees, not family inheritance. Control was no longer personal. It was architectural. Marcus Doyle sat across from her in the renovated boardroom of the Conservancy one late afternoon, reviewing final restructuring documents. "You've made it impossible for a single successor to dominate," he observed. "That was the point," Eleanor replied. "Not even you can unilaterally reverse this now." "I know." He looked up at her carefully. "Most founders struggle with that." She allowed herself a faint smile. "Most founders aren't nearly erased by their own succession plan." Outside the tall windows, scaffolding surrounded the opera house she had been preparing to restore before everything fractured. Work had resumed. Carefully. Deliberately. Life did not stop for betrayal. It adapted. Her vision had fully stabilized. Dr. Rahman confirmed complete recovery. The synthetic inhibitor left no permanent damage once exposure ceased. But something else had changed, something less visible. Trust had narrowed. Not vanished, but narrowed to those who understood weight-bearing integrity. Thomas Grady provided critical testimony linking Kessler's funding structures to pharmaceutical intermediaries. The corporate defense attempted distance, claimed ignorance, rogue contractors. Emails surfaced, internal memos referencing legacy obstructions. Her name appeared more than once. The narrative shifted from isolated familial misconduct to calculated destabilization of regulatory resistance. News outlets framed it as a cautionary tale of corporate overreach. Eleanor refused interviews after the first wave. She did not want to become a symbol. She wanted permanence. One evening, as rain traced thin lines down the Conservancy's windows, she received a letter. Handwritten. From Adrian. Marcus had warned her that communication attempts might begin once formal proceedings advanced. She turned the envelope over in her hands for several seconds before opening it. The handwriting was familiar. Controlled. "You misunderstood the scale of what we were facing," it began.
No apology.
Only justification. The firm was vulnerable. Kessler was going to acquire through litigation eventually. I chose the cleaner route. Temporary impairment was strategic, not malicious. Strategic. She read the word twice. "You taught me that preservation sometimes requires difficult decisions." Her jaw tightened slightly. "I never intended permanent harm." There it was again. Intent measured against outcome. She folded the letter once, then again, placed it back into the envelope, and locked it inside the same wall compartment that once held her contingency documents. Not as keepsake, as record. Several weeks later, Eleanor stood inside the Opera House balcony as restoration crews reinforced century-old support beams. Dust particles floated through angled sunlight. The scent of aged wood and plaster felt grounding. A young structural apprentice approached cautiously. "Ms. Hartwell," he said, "they say you're the reason this building wasn't demolished 5 years ago." She studied the exposed beams before answering. "No," she said calmly. "Documentation is the reason." I only insisted it be read. He hesitated. Is it true they tried to force you out? The question was earnest, not invasive. Yes, she said simply. And you fought back. She looked at him directly. I reinforced. He nodded slowly, absorbing the distinction. Reinforcement was not retaliation. It was stabilization against further harm. Later that evening, she attended the first public forum hosted by the Conservancy under its new charter. Community members filled the hall, teachers, architects, retirees, students. The board introduced multi-generational leadership initiatives, transparent financial reporting systems, and open-access archives documenting every restoration project in full detail.
No hidden clauses.
No private authority triggers. Protection embedded in visibility. When Eleanor stepped to the podium, the applause was warm but measured. She waited for quiet. For many years, she began, I've believed preservation meant defending buildings from demolition.
She paused.
I was wrong. The room listened closely. Preservation also means defending institutions from erosion, guarding decision-making processes from concentration, ensuring that no single successor can dismantle what took generations to build. Her voice did not tremble. We often mistake age for fragility. We assume that time weakens structures. She gestured lightly toward the vaulted ceiling above them. But the oldest beams in this hall carry the most weight. They have endured because they were built with intention. A few heads nodded. Legacy is not inheritance, she continued. It is stewardship. And stewardship requires transparency, not control. When she stepped down, the applause lasted longer. Not for drama, for clarity. That night, alone in her workshop, Eleanor reviewed the original blueprint of the first library she had ever restored. The paper was yellowed at the edges. Her annotations in faded, pencils still visible. She traced one margin lightly with her finger. The line was imperfect, adjusted mid-drawing, corrected before construction. She understood now that her life had followed similar logic. An unexpected fracture had appeared. It had not destroyed the structure. It had revealed where reinforcement was necessary. Adrian's trial concluded quietly months later. Plea agreement. Reduced sentence in exchange for testimony against corporate intermediaries. Eleanor did not attend sentencing. She read the summary in a single sitting, closed the file, and returned to work. Some relationships could not be restored, not because they lacked value, but because their foundational materials had changed composition. Restoration required integrity of substance, and that could not be forced. On the anniversary of the dinner at Blackwood Hall, Eleanor walked along the river near the old Courthouse Turn Club. The building still stood.
Polished.
Elegant. She paused across the street. She felt no anger, no grief sharp enough to wound, only recognition. That night had divided her life into before and after, but it had not diminished the total structure. It had clarified it. As dusk settled over the water, lights flickered on inside the historic district she had protected for decades. Warm windows, steady outlines, foundations untouched. They had tried to convince her that her time was over, that her perception was unreliable, that surrender was graceful. Instead, she had reinforced the framework beyond personal ownership, beyond familial leverage, beyond corporate manipulation. Buildings endure when their foundations are properly secured. So do people. Eleanor turned from the river and walked back toward the city she had helped preserve, not as a matriarch displaced, not as a victim vindicated, but as an architect who understood one final truth. Structures fail when pressure goes unexamined, and survive when reinforcement is built where no one expects it. Her steps were steady, her vision clear, and the foundations beneath her, finally beyond removal.